The bitter winter wind howled through Bismarck, North Dakota, carrying with it the sound of Lillian Andrews' desperate sobs as she pounded on the door that had just been slammed in her face. The year was 1885, and at 19 years old, Lillian found herself abandoned by the only family she had left in the world, with nothing but the clothes on her back and her mother's locket around her neck. "Please, Eleanor, it's freezing," Lillian begged, her voice growing hoarse as her stepmother's shadow disappeared from behind the frosted glass. "I did nothing wrong." The only response was the clicking of the lock and the sound of heavy footsteps retreating deeper into the house that had been her home since her father had married Eleanor 3 years ago. Before her father's death from pneumonia 4 months earlier, Lillian had endured her stepmother's cold demeanor and critical comments. But now, with her father gone, Eleanor had finally shown her true colors. "You've eaten my food and taken advantage of my hospitality long enough," Eleanor had declared earlier that evening, her eyes cold as the winter outside as she thrust a small bundle of Lillian's belongings into her arms. "Your father left everything to me, and I've no obligation to keep his grown daughter. You should have found a husband by now instead of burying your nose in those foolish books." Now, as the temperature dropped further and snow began to fall in earnest, Lillian hugged her thin woolen coat tighter around her body. The meager bundle containing a spare dress, her father's pocket watch, and a dog-eared copy of Pride and Prejudice offered little comfort against the brutal Dakota winter. Tears froze on her cheeks as she stumbled away from the house. The streets of Bismarck were nearly deserted, most sensible folk having retreated to their warm homes hours ago. The town had grown considerably since the railroad had come through, but in this weather, it might as well have been abandoned. Lillian had no plan, no destination in mind. Her closest friend, Mary, lived on the other side of town, but in this weather, such a journey seemed impossible. Instead, she found herself trudging toward the church, hoping that perhaps Pastor Williams might offer her sanctuary for the night. The snow was falling harder now, accumulating quickly on the ground. Lillian's shoes, more suitable for indoor wear than a winter storm, were soaked through, her feet numb with cold. The wind cut through her coat like it wasn't even there, and her fingers had long since lost feeling. "Just keep moving," she whispered to herself, her words carried away by the howling wind. But each step became more difficult than the last, her legs growing heavy, her mind foggy. She didn't notice when she wandered off the main street, didn't realize she was heading toward the outskirts of town where the prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizon. All she knew was that she was so terribly cold and so very tired. When she finally collapsed, the snow seemed almost welcoming, like a soft bed inviting her to rest. As consciousness began to slip away, Lillian thought she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats, but surely that was just her imagination. No one would be out in such weather. No one would find her here, half buried in the snow. "I'll just close my eyes for a moment," she murmured, as the world around her faded to white. Xavier Morgan pulled his hat lower over his face, cursing the storm and his own stubbornness for insisting on riding to town today. He'd spent the last 3 days at his cattle ranch 15 miles outside of Bismarck, but supplies were running low, and he'd been determined to make it to town before the weather worsened. He hadn't counted on the storm picking up so quickly. Now, as he urged his horse, Thunder, back toward his ranch, visibility had deteriorated to almost nothing. The landscape was a blur of white, landmarks erased by the driving snow. "Just follow the fence line, boy," he encouraged his horse, patting the animal's neck. "You know the way home better than I do." At 26, Xavier was no stranger to harsh Dakota winters. He'd built his ranch from nothing over the past 4 years, arriving in Bismarck with little more than determination and the skills he'd learned working cattle in Texas. Now, with a modest but growing herd and a solid reputation for fair dealing, he was beginning to feel he'd made something of himself. Thunder suddenly balked, snorting and tossing his head. Xavier leaned forward in the saddle, squinting through the curtain of snow. "What is it, boy?" "What do you see?" That's when he spotted it, a dark shape against the white, half covered by drifting snow. At first, he thought it might be a fallen tree branch or perhaps a lost calf, but as he drew closer, his heart lurched in his chest. "Good Lord," he breathed, dismounting quickly and trudging through knee-deep snow to reach the still form. It was a woman, her face deathly pale, her lips blue with cold. For a terrible moment he thought he'd found a corpse, but then he caught the faint rise and fall of her chest. "Miss, miss," he called, dropping to his knees beside her. When she didn't respond, he quickly removed his gloves and pressed his fingers to her neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, but weak and irregular. Without hesitation, Xavier shrugged out of his heavy buffalo coat and wrapped it around her still form. He gathered her in his arms, alarmed at how little she weighed, how fragile she felt against him. Her skin was ice cold, her clothing inadequate for the bitter weather. "Hang on, miss," he murmured, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "I'm going to get you somewhere warm." With practiced ease, he mounted Thunder while still cradling the unconscious woman, settling her in front of him in the saddle. He wrapped one arm securely around her waist, holding the reins with his other hand. "Home, Thunder. Fast as you can, boy." The horse needed no further encouragement, seeming to understand the urgency of their situation. Xavier hunched forward, trying to shield the woman's body with his own as they pushed through the blinding snow toward his ranch. As they rode, Xavier found himself talking to the unconscious woman, partly to keep himself alert in the numbing cold, partly out of a desperate hope that his voice might somehow reach her. "My ranch isn't far. Got a good fire going before I left. We'll get you warmed up in no time." He glanced down at her still face, noting the delicate features beneath the mask of cold. "What were you doing out in this weather anyway? Don't you know better than to wander around in a blizzard?" There was no response, of course, but he kept talking anyway, a steady stream of words to combat the howling of the wind. "Name's Xavier Morgan. Most folks call me Zav. Got about 50 head of cattle, though I'm hoping to double that by next year if the weather holds and prices stay decent. Built the house myself. Nothing fancy, but it's solid. Keeps the cold out mostly." He wasn't sure how long they rode. The storm obscured all landmarks, and time seemed to stretch and distort in the white void surrounding them. But Thunder knew his way, and eventually, the welcome sight of Xavier's ranch house emerged from the swirling snow. The modest structure was built of sturdy logs, with a stable attached to one side. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, a promise of warmth within. Xavier had never been so relieved to see his own home. He managed to dismount without dropping his precious burden, then kicked open the door to his cabin. Inside, the fire had burned low but was still giving off heat. Xavier carried the woman to his bed, gently laying her down on the rough wool blankets. In the warm glow of the fire, he could see her more clearly now. Young, maybe 19 or 20, with long auburn hair matted with snow and ice. Her face, though pale with cold, was striking high cheekbones, delicate nose, full lips now tinged with blue. She wore a simple dress beneath her inadequate coat, both soaked through with melting snow. Xavier hesitated, knowing what needed to be done but uncomfortable with the impropriety of it. He was no doctor, but he knew the dangers of extreme cold. Her wet clothes would only draw more heat from her body. "Miss, can you hear me?" He tried again, tapping her cheek lightly. When she remained unresponsive, he sighed, his decision made. I'm sorry about this, but those wet clothes have to come off before you freeze to death. As respectfully as possible, Xavier removed her sodden coat, dress, and undergarments, his movements clinical and efficient. He averted his eyes as much as possible while wrapping her in every blanket he owned, placing her closer to the fire, which he quickly stoked back to full strength. Once she was bundled up, he set a pot of water to heat on the stove, then went back out into the storm to tend to Thunder. The horse deserved extra care after his heroic effort. When he returned, stamping snow from his boots, the woman remained unconscious, but her color seemed slightly improved. Xavier pulled a chair close to the bed and settled into wait, wondering who she was and how she had ended up alone in the deadly winter night. Lillian first became aware of warmth. It enveloped her like a cocoon, seeping slowly into her bones. Then came the pain, a burning, tingling sensation in her fingers and toes that gradually spread through her limbs. She moaned softly, the sound strange and distant to her own ears. "You're awake." The voice was deep, unfamiliar, and decidedly male. Her eyes flew open, then immediately squeezed shut against the sudden brightness. Slowly, cautiously, she opened them again, blinking to adjust to the light of a nearby oil lamp. A man sat in a wooden chair beside the bed where she lay. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends and a strong, clean-shaven jaw. His eyes, a striking shade of green, watched her with concern. Panic surged through Lillian as she realized she was in a strange place with a man she didn't know. She tried to sit up, only to discover she was wrapped tightly in multiple blankets and wearing nothing underneath them. The realization sent heat flooding to her face. "Where am I? Who are you?" Her voice emerged as little more than a croak. "Easy now," the man said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "You're safe. My name is Xavier Morgan. I found you collapsed in the snow outside town, brought you to my ranch. You were half frozen." Memory came rushing back, Alina throwing her out, the bitter cold, the endless white. Lillian shuddered, drawing the blankets tighter around herself. "My clothes," she whispered, mortification coloring her cheeks. Xavier had the grace to look uncomfortable. "They were soaked through. You would have died of cold if I'd left them on you." He cleared his throat. "I was as respectful as I could be, miss. They're drying by the fire now." Lillian believed him, though the situation was still shocking. She'd never been so vulnerable before a man in her life. "Thank you," she managed, recognizing that despite the impropriety, he had saved her life. "I'm Lillian Andrews." Xavier nodded, then rose to his feet. "Miss Andrews, can I offer you some hot coffee or perhaps broth? You need to warm from the inside too. Broth would be appreciated, thank you." She watched as he moved to the stove, noticing the easy grace with which he navigated the small cabin. It was a simple space, one main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, and the bed where she now lay. Clean and orderly, if sparsely furnished. While Xavier busied himself with the broth, Lillian took stock of her condition. Her fingers and toes throbbed painfully, but she could move them, which she knew was a good sign. Her head ached, and she felt weak, but she was alive, something that had seemed unlikely when she'd collapsed in the snow. "May I ask what you were doing out in such weather?" Xavier asked as he returned with a mug of steaming broth. Lillian accepted it gratefully, the warmth seeping into her cold, stiffened fingers. She hesitated, shame washing over her at having to explain her circumstances. "My stepmother threw me out," she finally said, her voice small. "My father died 4 months ago, and she decided she no longer wanted me in her house." Xavier's expression darkened. "She threw you out, in the middle of a blizzard. Lillian nodded, taking a sip of the broth to avoid meeting his eyes. The storm wasn't so bad when I first left, but it got worse quickly. That's... Xavier seemed to struggle for words. That's monstrous. She could have killed you. Perhaps that was the intention, Lillian said softly, surprised at her own candor with this stranger. She never liked me much. I think she only tolerated me because of my father. Xavier shook his head in disbelief. Do you have anywhere else to go? Family? Friends? I have a friend in town, Mary Wilson. Her family might take me in, at least temporarily. Lillian wasn't entirely sure of this. Mary's home was already crowded with her large family, but it was the only option she could think of. Well, you're not going anywhere until this storm passes, Xavier said firmly. And not until you're fully recovered. Those fingers and toes need time to heal. Lillian looked down at her hands, noticing for the first time how red and swollen they appeared. How long was I unconscious? About 4 hours. It's just past midnight now. Midnight. She had been thrown out shortly after dinner, around 6 o'clock. She had wandered in the cold for nearly 2 hours before collapsing. It was a miracle she had survived. I'm deeply in your debt, Mr. Morgan, she said, meeting his gaze directly. You saved my life. Something flickered in Xavier's green eyes, compassion, perhaps, or something deeper. Any decent person would have done the same, he said, though they both knew that wasn't necessarily true. Many might have ridden past, focused only on their own survival in the treacherous storm. Rest now, he added, taking the empty mug from her hands. We can figure everything else out in the morning. Where will you sleep? Lillian asked, suddenly aware she was occupying his bed. Don't worry about me. I've slept in the chair plenty of times. As if to demonstrate, Xavier settled back into the wooden chair, stretching his long legs toward the fire. Lillian wanted to protest, but found her eyelids growing heavy again, the ordeal of the day catching up with her. Thank you, she murmured, already drifting toward sleep. The last thing she saw was Xavier's gentle smile and the way the firelight caught in his dark hair, turning it to burnished copper. Sleep well, Miss Andrews, he replied softly. You're safe now. And for the first time since her father's death, Lillian believed it might be true. The storm raged for 3 days, keeping Xavier and Lillian confined to the small cabin. Under normal circumstances, such proximity between an unmarried man and woman would have been scandalous, but the harsh realities of frontier life often necessitated putting survival before propriety. By the morning after her rescue, Lillian's clothes had dried, and Xavier had discreetly left the cabin while she dressed. When he returned, stamping snow from his boots, she was sitting at his table, her hair neatly braided, looking remarkably composed given her ordeal. The animals are fed, he announced, hanging his coat by the door. Storm's showing no signs of letting up, though. Lillian nodded, folding her hands in her lap. I hope I'm not imposing too severely on your hospitality, Mr. Morgan. Xavier waved away her concern as he moved to stoke the fire. No imposition. Can't exactly turn you out in this weather, can I? His lips quirked in a half-smile. Besides, it's nice having someone to talk to besides the cattle. Over a breakfast of cornbread and coffee, they began to learn more about each other. Xavier told Lillian about his journey from Texas to Dakota Territory 4 years earlier, seeking land of his own after years of working other men's cattle. Never cared much for having a boss, he explained, refilling her coffee cup. Wanted something that would be mine, that I could build with my own hands. And have you built what you wanted? Lillian asked, genuinely interested. Xavier considered this, his green eyes thoughtful. Getting there. Ranch isn't much yet, 50 head of cattle, this cabin, the barn. But it's growing. Another few good years I might be able to add onto the house, increase the herd. He smiled suddenly, transforming his serious face. What about you, Miss Andrews? What were your plans before? Recent events? Lillian looked down at her coffee. I never had much opportunity for plans. My mother died when I was 12, and I kept house for my father until he remarried 3 years ago. After that, she shrugged slightly. Eleanor, my stepmother, made it clear my primary responsibility was to find a suitable husband. She was quite disappointed when I showed more interest in books than in the eligible men of Bismarck. You like to read? Xavier asked, nodding toward the small bundle of her possessions he'd recovered, where the edge of a book was visible. Very much. My father encouraged it, even though many thought it unnecessary for a girl. Xavier rose from the table and crossed to a small bookshelf on the far wall, a luxury Lillian hadn't expected in a bachelor's cabin. Not much of a collection compared to what you might be used to, but you're welcome to them while you're here. Lillian examined the shelf with interest. There were practical books on animal husbandry and agriculture, a Bible, and to her surprise, several novels, Cooper, Twain, and even a volume of Shakespeare. People are often surprised I can read at all, Xavier commented, noting her expression. Assume because I work with my hands, my mind must be simple. Lillian flushed, embarrassed to be so transparent. I didn't mean to imply you didn't, he assured her, but others have. My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father. She made sure her children valued education, even after we moved to a ranch where books were less common than cattle. The mention of family prompted Lillian to ask, "Do you have siblings?" A shadow passed over Xavier's face. Had 2 brothers, lost them both in the war. Parents passed a few years back, it's just me now. I'm sorry, Lillian said softly, understanding the loneliness of being the last of one's family. Xavier shrugged, his expression clearing. It's the way of things, but it's why I came north. Too many ghosts in Texas. The conversation shifted to lighter topics as the day progressed. Xavier taught Lillian how to play checkers using a hand-carved set he'd made during a previous winter. She proved to be a quick study, winning their 3rd game, much to his mock chagrin. You're a natural strategist, Miss Andrews, he declared as she captured his final piece. Lillian laughed, the sound surprising her. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed with genuine pleasure. Or perhaps you're just a generous opponent, Mr. Morgan. Xavier, he corrected her. If we're going to be snowed in together, might as well use Christian names. Then you must call me Lillian, she responded, feeling strangely liberated by the informality. As dusk approached, Xavier excused himself to tend to the animals again, bundling up against the continuing storm. Lillian used his absence to explore the cabin more thoroughly, noting the small touches that made it a home rather than just a shelter, the carefully crafted furniture, the colorful quilt on the bed, a sketch of a Texas landscape pinned to one wall. She was examining a photograph of a smiling family, presumably Xavier with his parents and brothers in happier times, when the door burst open, bringing with it a gust of snow and a frost-covered Xavier. All creatures accounted for and fed, he announced, stamping his feet and hanging his snow-encrusted coat by the door. Though that old hen is getting mighty irritated at being cooped up in the barn instead of her normal house. Lillian smiled, carefully replacing the photograph. I can sympathize with her frustration at confinement, though I'm certainly grateful for the shelter. Xavier's expression softened as he crossed to the fire, extending his hands toward the warmth. Speaking of shelter, I've been thinking. The chair isn't the most comfortable bed for more than a night or 2. Lillian tensed, uncertain where this conversation was heading. Xavier must have sensed her apprehension because he quickly added, I thought I might make up a pallet here by the fire for you and take back the bed. Or the other way around if you prefer the floor. Either way, we both get a more comfortable night's sleep." "Oh," Lillian relaxed. "Yes, that seems sensible, and you should have your bed back. I'll be perfectly comfortable by the fire." Xavier shook his head firmly. "Wouldn't be proper. You take the bed, I'll take the floor." "But it's your home, and you're my guest," he interrupted. "My mother would rise from her grave and box my ears if I made a lady sleep on the floor while I took the bed." His tone made it clear the matter was settled, and Lillian didn't press further. Instead, she helped him prepare a simple supper of beans and salt pork, moving around the small kitchen area with growing confidence. As they ate, Xavier asked about her life in Bismarck, and Lillian found herself sharing more than she had intended: her father's loving but stern nature, her joy in teaching the young children at Sunday school, her dream of perhaps becoming a proper teacher someday. "You'd be good at it," Xavier observed. "You're patient. Explained those checker rules to me like I wasn't simple when I kept forgetting them." Lillian smiled at the compliment. "It was my mother's profession before she married. Perhaps it's in my blood, as your mother's love of books was in yours." The parallel seemed to please Xavier, his green eyes warming. "Funny how our parents shape us, even after they're gone." That night, after Xavier had made up his pallet by the fire and Lillian had retired to the bed, she lay awake listening to the howling wind outside and the steady breathing of the man who had saved her life. She should have been uncomfortable, even frightened, alone in a cabin with a man she barely knew. Instead, she felt safer than she had in years. The next morning, Lillian woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Xavier was already up, cooking breakfast at the small stove. Through the cabin's single window, she could see the storm still raging, showing no signs of abating. "Good morning," Xavier greeted her, his voice cheerful despite the continuing bad weather. "Slept better on the bed than that chair, I hope." "Much better, thank you," Lillian confirmed, self-consciously smoothing her hair. Without a mirror or proper toiletries, she feared she looked a fright, but Xavier's appreciative glance as she joined him at the table suggested otherwise. The second day of their confinement passed in companionable activities. Xavier showed Lillian how to mend harness leather, his large hands surprisingly deft with the awl and wax thread. In return, she helped him darn several pairs of socks that had been awaiting attention. "Not how I'd usually spend time with a pretty woman," Xavier joked as they worked together at the table. "Usually I'd be trying to impress her with my riding or shooting, not my sock-darning skills." Lillian laughed, finding his straightforward manner refreshing after the artificial politeness of town society. "I find competence in everyday tasks far more impressive than showmanship, Mr. Morgan Xavier," she corrected herself. "That's so," he looked pleased. "Well, I'm competent at quite a few everyday tasks. Cooking, cleaning, mending. Man living alone has to be." "You've never considered marriage?" Lillian asked, then immediately blushed at her forwardness. "I apologize, that's much too personal a question." Xavier didn't seem offended. "It's a fair question. I've considered it. Hard to find the right woman out here, though. Most ladies in town aren't eager to marry a rancher 15 miles from civilization, with no other women for company and plenty of hard work from sunup to sundown." There was something wistful in his tone that tugged at Lillian's heart. "It would take a special kind of woman," she agreed. "Someone who values independence and isn't afraid of hard work." "Exactly." Xavier glanced at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "What about you? Your stepmother's efforts to marry you off didn't work. Was that because the men weren't to your liking, or the institution itself?" Lillian considered the question carefully. "I've nothing against marriage in principle. My parents' union was a happy one. But I've seen too many women trapped in miserable marriages because they had no other options. I wanted more than just security. I wanted a partnership, mutual respect." She smiled ruefully. Eleanor thought such notions were ridiculous romanticism. "Doesn't sound ridiculous to me," Xavier said quietly. Their eyes met across the table, and Lillian felt a curious flutter in her chest, which she quickly attributed to the lingering effects of her ordeal in the snow. On the third day, the storm finally began to subside. Xavier spent most of the morning outside, clearing paths to the barn and checking for damage to the outbuildings. When he returned, stomping snow from his boots, his expression was one of satisfaction. "Everything's intact. Storm's easing up. Roads should be passable by tomorrow or the day after." Lillian felt an unexpected twinge of disappointment at the news. The past 3 days, despite their unusual circumstances, had been peaceful, even pleasant. The thought of returning to Bismarck, of facing Eleanor and the uncertainties of her future, filled her with dread. "That's good news," she said nonetheless, forcing a smile. Xavier studied her face, his green eyes perceptive. "Is it? You don't look pleased." Lillian hesitated, then admitted, "I'm not sure what awaits me in Bismarck. My stepmother made it clear I'm not welcome in my former home. My friend Mary might be able to take me in temporarily, but her family's resources are already stretched thin." Xavier frowned, leaning against the doorframe. "You've no other family, no relatives who might help?" "None. My father was an only child, and my mother's family remained in Pennsylvania when we moved west. We lost touch after her death." A silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the muffled sounds of the wind outside. Finally, Xavier spoke, his tone careful. "I have a proposition for you, Lillian. One that might solve your immediate problem, though I understand if you find it inappropriate." Lillian tensed, uncertain what to expect. "What sort of proposition?" Xavier ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of nervousness. "I need help around the ranch. Spring will be here before we know it, and there'll be calving, planting, 100 tasks that are easier with an extra pair of hands. And as you've seen, the place could use a woman's touch. Are you offering me employment?" Lillian asked, surprised. "Yes. Room, board, and a small wage. You could stay in the cabin. I'd move to the bunkhouse out back. It's not much, but it's weathertight. There'd be no impropriety." The offer was unexpected, and Lillian found herself speechless. Part of her wanted to accept immediately. The ranch was peaceful, the work honest, and Xavier's company unexpectedly enjoyable. But another part of her recognized the potential for gossip, the raised eyebrows that would result from such an arrangement. "I appreciate the offer, truly," she said carefully. "But wouldn't people talk? A single woman living on the property of an unmarried man." Xavier nodded, acknowledging her concern. "They might. Though if we're being honest, they'll talk regardless when they learn you spent 3 days alone with me during the storm. Reputations are fragile things out here." Lillian hadn't considered this aspect. He was right. Her reputation, already potentially compromised by her current situation, might not suffer much additional damage from accepting his offer. "I'd need to think about it," she said finally. "It's a generous proposition, but—" "Of course," Xavier agreed quickly. "No need to decide now. Think it over. Offer stands either way." The rest of the day passed with a new undercurrent of tension between them, both aware of the decision hanging in the air. Lillian found herself watching Xavier more closely, trying to determine if there was any hidden motive behind his offer. But his behavior remained respectful, his manner kind but never presumptuous. That evening, as they sat before the fire after supper, Xavier told stories of his cattle drives in Texas, painting vivid pictures of life on the trail that made Lillian laugh and gasp in turn. When he described the vast starlit skies of the open prairie, his voice took on a reverent quality that resonated with something deep in Lillian's soul. "That's why I chose ranching, despite all its hardships," he explained, his face illuminated by the dancing firelight. "There's a freedom to it, a connection to the land and the seasons that I never found elsewhere." "It sounds wonderful," Lillian said softly, "different from anything I've known." Xavier studied her thoughtfully. "You've spent your whole life in town, mostly. My father was a shopkeeper. We came to Bismarck when I was 14 after the railroad arrived. Before that, we lived in St. Louis. And you never yearned for something different, something more." Lillian gazed into the fire, considering. "I suppose I did in my way, through books mostly. They were my escape when life felt too confined." "Books are well and good," Xavier said, "but there's nothing like experiencing the real thing. Feeling the wind on your face as you ride across open country, watching a new calf take its first wobbly steps, seeing the seasons change the land before your eyes." The passion in his voice was captivating, and Lillian found herself imagining such a life working alongside this man, learning the rhythms of the ranch, discovering capabilities she never knew she possessed. "Tell me honestly," she said suddenly, "why did you offer me a position here? Is it truly just because you need help?" Xavier met her gaze directly. "Partly. I do need help, that's no lie, but—" He hesitated, then continued with characteristic frankness. "I also enjoy your company. These past days, despite the circumstances, have been the least lonely I've felt in a long time. Selfish of me, perhaps." His honesty touched her. "Not selfish. Human." They sat in companionable silence as the fire burned low. When Lillian finally retired to the bed, her mind was whirling with possibilities. By morning, she had made her decision. The road to Bismarck was still partially blocked by snowdrifts, but Xavier's sturdy wagon made steady progress, drawn by 2 strong draft horses. Lillian sat beside him on the seat, bundled in layers of clothing borrowed from Xavier, including a fur-lined coat that had belonged to his mother. "Suits you better than it did her," Xavier commented as they approached the outskirts of town. She was a small woman. Always complained this coat made her look like a grizzly bear. Lillian smiled, appreciating his attempt to lighten the mood. She was nervous about the confrontation to come, about explaining her decision to the few people in Bismarck who might care about her welfare. Their first stop was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller was a gruff but fair-minded man who had been friendly with Lillian's father. He listened in growing anger as Lillian explained how a leaner had thrown her out during the beginning of the blizzard. "That's criminal negligence, Miss Andrews," he said, his bushy eyebrows drawn together in a scowl. "Could be considered attempted murder in this weather. I've a mind to arrest her." "I don't wish to press charges," Lillian said firmly. "I only wanted to inform you of my circumstances and my decision to accept employment at Mr. Morgan's ranch." The sheriff's gaze shifted to Xavier, assessing. "Morgan, you run that spread about 15 miles east, correct?" Xavier nodded. "Yes, sir. Miss Andrews will have her own quarters." "Everything proper?" Sheriff Miller's mustache twitched. "Proper or not, there'll be talk. You understand that, Miss Andrews?" "I do," Lillian acknowledged. "But given the alternative of being homeless or dependent on charity, I believe it's the best option available to me." The sheriff seemed to accept this, though his expression remained concerned. "Very well. I'll keep an eye on things, and I'll have a word with your stepmother, make sure she understands she can't just toss people out to freeze." Their next stop was Mary Wilson's home, where Lillian was greeted with tears and embraces from her friend. "We've been so worried," Mary exclaimed, "when no one had seen you after the storm began. Father and the other men searched, but the weather was too severe." I was incredibly fortunate, Lillian said, squeezing Mary's hands. Mr. Morgan found me just in time. Mary eyed Xavier with open curiosity as Lillian explained her plans. To Lillian's relief, her friend didn't seem shocked or disapproving. It makes sense, Mary said after hearing her out. What other choice do you have? And Mr. Morgan has a good reputation in town. Honest in his dealings from what Father says. Xavier cleared his throat, looking slightly embarrassed at this assessment. Miss Andrews will be treated with the utmost respect, he assured Mary. You're welcome to visit any time to see for yourself. Mary smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. I'll hold you to that, Mr. Morgan. Their final stop was Aline's house, Lillian's former home. She insisted on going alone, though Xavier waited vigilantly with the wagon just outside. Aline opened the door with her usual pinched expression, which transformed to shock at the sight of Lillian. You're alive, she said flatly, making no move to invite her inside. No thanks to you, Lillian replied, drawing on newfound strength. I've come for the rest of my belongings. My mother's jewelry, my books, and the portrait of my parents. Aline's eyes narrowed. Your father left everything to me. Those items are mine now. Not the personal effects of my mother, who died long before you entered our lives, Lillian countered. Sheriff Miller agrees with me on this point. He suggested I bring him along, but I thought we might handle this civilly. The mention of the sheriff had the desired effect. Aline's face paled slightly and she stepped back. Wait here. She returned moments later with a small trunk, which she practically thrust into Lillian's arms. Take it and go. I don't want to see you again. That makes two of us, Lillian said calmly. Goodbye, Aline. As she turned to leave, Aline called after her. People are already talking, you know. About you being alone with that rancher during the storm. No decent man will marry you now. Lillian paused, then looked back over her shoulder. I don't require a decent man to marry me. I've found something better, my independence. With that, she walked away, her head high, leaving her stepmother open-mouthed on the doorstep. Xavier helped her load the trunk into the wagon, his expression concerned. Everything all right? Better than all right, Lillian assured him, feeling lighter than she had in months. I'm ready to leave Bismarck behind. As they drove out of town, Lillian didn't look back. The road ahead might be uncertain, but for the first time in her life, she was making her own choices, carving out her own path. The next week saw Lillian settling into life at the Morgan Ranch. True to his word, Xavier moved his belongings to the small bunkhouse behind the main cabin, insisting Lillian take the more comfortable dwelling. The arrangement was unconventional, but practical. She had charge of the cooking, cleaning, and henhouse, while Xavier managed the cattle, repairs, and heavier work. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the Dakota prairie, though cold snaps and occasional snowfalls continued through February. Lillian learned quickly, adapting to ranch life with a determination that seemed to both surprise and impress Xavier. He taught her to ride properly, not side saddle as she'd been instructed in town, but astride, practical for ranch work. Her first attempts were awkward and sore, but she persisted, taking silent pride in Xavier's approving nod when she finally managed to canter around the paddock without clinging desperately to the saddle horn. You're a natural, he declared, helping her dismount from the gentle mare he'd assigned to her. Another month you'll be ready for roundup. Roundup? Lillian asked, alarmed. Surely you don't expect me to? Xavier laughed, the sound warming her despite the chill air. Just teasing. Though you might enjoy watching from a distance. It's quite a sight. As February turned to March, bringing the first hints of spring, Lillian found herself watching Xavier when he wasn't aware the confident way he handled the horses, his patience with the pregnant cows as calving season approached, the quiet competence with which he managed the 1,000 tasks required to keep the ranch running. She noticed other things too, the way sunlight brought out auburn highlights in his dark hair, how his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the surprising gentleness of his large, roughened hands when treating an injured animal. These observations left her feeling confused and slightly guilty. Xavier was her employer, nothing more. The arrangement between them was practical, not romantic, and yet, increasingly, she found her thoughts wandering in directions that were decidedly impractical. Xavier, for his part, maintained a respectful distance, though she occasionally caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Their interactions remained friendly but proper, their conversations centering on ranch matters or safe topics like books and town gossip brought by occasional visitors. Mary was the most frequent caller, riding out from Bismarck whenever weather permitted. She brought news of town, including the satisfying information that Sheriff Miller had indeed confronted a leaner about her actions, resulting in the woman becoming something of a pariah in local society. "Serves her right," Mary declared during one visit as she and Lillian prepared dinner while Xavier was out checking the herd. "Though some folks are certainly talking about your situation here as well." Lillian continued kneading bread dough, unsurprised. "Let them talk. I'm earning my keep, honestly." Mary gave her a sidelong look. "That's not all they're speculating about. Half the town thinks you and Mr. Morgan will be announcing a wedding by summer." The dough received a particularly vigorous punch as Lillian absorbed this information. "That's ridiculous. Our arrangement is purely professional." "Is it?" Mary asked, her tone innocent as she chopped vegetables. "Because the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching suggests otherwise." "Mary," Lillian exclaimed, feeling heat rise to her face, "you're imagining things." Mary shrugged, unconvinced. "If you say so. Though I don't know why you're so opposed to the idea. Xavier Morgan is considered quite a catch, hard-working, honest, decent-looking." She grinned mischievously. "More than decent-looking, actually." "I'm not opposed to the idea," Lillian admitted before she could stop herself. "I mean, that's not what I meant." Mary's laughter cut her off. "Oh, Lillian, you're sweet on him, aren't you?" "Keep your voice down," Lillian hissed, though Xavier was nowhere near the cabin. "It doesn't matter how I feel. He offered me employment, not courtship. I won't complicate things by developing inappropriate feelings." Mary's expression softened. "There's nothing inappropriate about two unmarried adults developing an attachment, Lil. Especially not two who clearly respect each other as you two do." Lillian shook her head firmly, returning to her bread dough. "It's too soon. I've only known him a few months, and I'm only just beginning to stand on my own feet. I can't become dependent on another man so quickly, no matter how kind he might be." "Fair enough," Mary conceded. "But don't close your heart entirely. Not all men are like your father or your stepmother's sort. Some might actually want a partner, not just a dependent." The conversation lingered in Lillian's mind long after Mary had departed. Was Mary right? Did Xavier see her as more than just a hired helper? And if so, was she ready to consider such possibilities? Spring arrived in earnest by early April, bringing with it the miracle of new life. The first calves began to appear, wobble-legged and curious, their mothers protective and attentive. Lillian found herself utterly captivated by the tiny creatures, spending hours watching them frolic in the growing green of the pastures. It was during one such peaceful afternoon that something shifted between her and Xavier. She was sitting on the split-rail fence, observing a particularly adventurous calf testing its legs when Xavier joined her, leaning on the rail beside her. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said softly. "Never gets old, watching new life find its way." Lillian nodded, smiling as the calf made a sudden, startled jump at a butterfly's passage. "It's wonderful. I never imagined ranch life could be so fulfilling." Xavier turned to look at her, something warm in his gaze. "You've taken to it remarkably well." Most town women would have run screaming back to civilization after the first week of hauling water and feeding chickens. "I'm not most town women," Lillian replied, meeting his eyes. "No," Xavier agreed quietly. "You're not." A moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Lillian became acutely aware of his proximity, of the clean scent of soap and sunshine that clung to him, of the slight roughness of his hand resting inches from hers on the wooden rail. "Lillian," he began, his voice low and serious. "I've been wanting to tell you," but whatever he intended to say was interrupted by the sudden arrival of a rider, approaching fast from the direction of town. They both turned, the moment broken as the horseman drew closer. It was a young man Lillian recognized as one of Sheriff Miller's deputies. He reined in his lathered horse, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Miss Andrews, Mr. Morgan. Sheriff sent me. There's been an accident in town fire at the general store, several buildings affected. Sheriff's organizing volunteers to help with rescue and salvage. Asked if Mr. Morgan might come, bring any hands he could spare." Xavier straightened immediately. "Of course, I'll saddle up right away." He turned to Lillian. "Will you be all right here alone?" "I might be gone overnight, depending on how bad it is." "I'll be fine," she assured him. "Go, they need you," he nodded, already moving toward the barn. "I'll leave Thunder in the paddock. If there's any trouble, he's fastest. You remember the way to the Johansson's place 2 miles west?" "Yes." "But don't worry about me. I can manage." Xavier paused, looking back at her with an expression that made her breath catch. "I know you can. That's what makes you special, Lillian Andrews." Before she could respond, he was gone, striding purposefully toward the barn. Within 15 minutes, he and the deputy were riding hard for town, leaving Lillian with a curious mixture of pride at his confidence in her and disappointment at the interrupted conversation. Whatever he had been about to say would have to wait. The fire in Bismarck proved to be serious but not catastrophic. 3 businesses were completely destroyed, including the general store where it had started, but quick action by townspeople had prevented the flames from spreading to residential areas. Xavier returned late the following day, tired and smoke-stained but unhurt. Lillian had a hot meal waiting and bathwater heating on the stove. She tried not to show how relieved she was to see him, maintaining a practical demeanor as she served him stew and fresh bread. "Everyone all right in town?" she asked, pouring him coffee. Xavier nodded, fatigue evident in his slumped shoulders. "No lives lost, thankfully. Some injuries, mostly minor burns and smoke inhalation. Henderson's lost everything in their store, though. Community's taking up a collection to help them rebuild." "We should contribute," Lillian said without hesitation. "Mr. Henderson was always kind to me after Mother died." Xavier smiled faintly, warmed by her generous spirit. "Already put our names down for lumber and labor when reconstruction begins." "Told them you'd likely organize the women to provide meals for the workers, too." "Of course," Lillian agreed, pleased he had anticipated her wishes so accurately. "How soon will they start rebuilding?" "Week or 2. Need to clear the debris first, order supplies." Xavier stifled a yawn. "Sorry. Been a long couple of days." "Your bath will be ready soon," Lillian assured him. "You should rest afterward. The ranch chores are all done. I managed everything while you were gone." Xavier looked at her with something like wonder. "You did, all of it?" "Well, I didn't brand any cattle or break any horses," she clarified with a small smile. "But the essential things, yes. The animals are fed, eggs collected, garden tended, even fixed that loose board on the chicken coop that's been driving you mad." "Lillian Andrews," Xavier said, shaking his head slowly, "you are a remarkable woman." The simple compliment warmed her more than it should have. "It's nothing special, just doing what needed doing." "That's exactly what makes it special." His green eyes held hers for a long moment before he looked away, clearing his throat. "Bath ready yet? I must smell like a campfire." The moment passed, but something had changed between them, a subtle shift that both recognized but neither acknowledged aloud. Over the next weeks, as spring settled fully on the prairie, and the ranch burst into a frenzy of activity, they fell into a rhythm of working together that felt increasingly like a partnership rather than an employer-employee relationship. Xavier began consulting Lillian on ranch decisions, valuing her practical intelligence and growing knowledge of agricultural matters. For her part, Lillian found confidence in her new skills, pride in her contributions to the ranch's success, and an increasing awareness that her feelings for Xavier had developed far beyond gratitude or friendly regard. Still, neither spoke of these deeper emotions, each perhaps waiting for the other to make the first move, both conscious of the complexities their situation presented. It was Mary who finally forced the issue, during a Sunday visit in late May. The three of them had enjoyed dinner together, after which Xavier excused himself to check on a pregnant mare, leaving the women to visit alone. As soon as he was out of earshot, Mary turned to Lillian with exasperation written across her face. "For heaven's sake, Lil, how long are you two going to circle around each other like shy schoolchildren? It's painful to watch." Lillian busied herself clearing the table, avoiding her friend's knowing gaze. "I don't know what you mean." "You know exactly what I mean. That man is head over heels for you and you for him, yet you both pretend it's nothing more than a business arrangement. It's ridiculous." Lillian set the plates down with more force than intended. "It's complicated, Mary." "It's only complicated because you're making it so," Mary insisted. "What are you afraid of?" The question struck home, forcing Lillian to confront her own hesitations. What was she afraid of? Losing her newfound independence? Being hurt? Or perhaps most frightening of all, discovering that the depth of her feelings wasn't reciprocated? "I'm afraid of misreading the situation," she finally admitted. "What if you're wrong? What if he doesn't feel that way about me? I could lose everything, my position here, my home, his friendship." Mary's expression softened. "Oh, Lil, I'm not wrong. Anyone with eyes can see how that man looks at you, but if you need more certainty—" She hesitated, then continued with a hint of mischief. "The town social is next Saturday. Why don't you ask Xavier to escort you? His response should tell you all you need to know." The suggestion was both terrifying and tempting. "Wouldn't that be forward of me?" "Forward," Mary laughed. "It's 1885, not 1850. A woman can surely ask a man to accompany her to a town gathering without causing a scandal." By the time Xavier returned from the barn, Lillian had made up her mind. After Mary departed, she found him on the porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. "Beautiful evening," she commented, joining him at the railing. Xavier nodded, a contentment in his features that hadn't been there when she first met him. "One of the things I love about this place. Sky goes on forever." Gathering her courage, Lillian broached the subject that had been on her mind. "Mary mentioned there's a town social next Saturday." Xavier acknowledged, still gazing at the horizon. "Annual spring dance, if I recall." "Yes, exactly." Lillian took a deep breath. "I was wondering if you might like to escort me." Xavier turned to her then, surprise evident in his expression. "You want to go to the social with me?" Lillian's confidence wavered at his reaction. "Unless you'd rather not." "I understand if—" "No," Xavier interrupted quickly. "I mean yes, I'd like to escort you, very much." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she now recognized as a sign of nervousness. "I just didn't think you'd want to, that is, considering our unusual situation." "Our situation doesn't need to prevent us from enjoying a community gathering," Lillian said carefully, uncertain how to interpret his flustered response. "And it would be nice to have an evening of music and conversation." Xavier's features relaxed into a smile that made her heart skip. "Then I'd be honored to escort you, Miss Andrews." The formality made her laugh. "I think after all this time, you can call me Lillian at a social dance, Mr. Morgan." His smile broadened. "And you must definitely call me Xavier, Lillian." The way he said her name, with a warmth that seemed to caress each syllable, sent a pleasant shiver through her. Perhaps Mary was right after all. The night of the social arrived clear and mild, perfect for the outdoor gathering in Bismarck's town square. Lillian wore her best dress, a blue cotton with white trim that she'd carefully altered to match the current fashion as best she could. Her hair was arranged in a simple but elegant style, with a few curls framing her face. When she emerged from the cabin, Xavier was waiting beside the wagon, dressed in his Sunday best clean black trousers, a white shirt, and a vest that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. He'd trimmed his hair and beard, and the overall effect was striking enough to momentarily rob Lillian of words. Xavier seemed similarly affected, staring at her with undisguised admiration. "You look beautiful," he said simply. Lillian felt a blush warm her cheeks. "Thank you. You look very handsome yourself." The drive to town was filled with an anticipation that made ordinary conversation difficult. Lillian found herself hyper-aware of Xavier beside her on the wagon seat, of the occasional brush of his arm against hers when the wheels hit a rut in the road. The town square was transformed for the social, with lanterns strung between trees, tables laden with food and drink, and a platform where a small band of local musicians played lively tunes. Nearly everyone in Bismarck and the surrounding area seemed to be in attendance, creating a festive atmosphere that immediately lifted Lillian's spirits. As Xavier helped her down from the wagon, several people called greetings, including Sheriff Miller, who approached with a friendly nod. "Miss Andrews, Morgan, good to see you both." His eyes twinkled beneath bushy brows. "Heard the ranch is doing well this season." "Can't complain," Xavier replied. "New calves are strong, crops coming in nicely. And Miss Andrews has settled in well, I take it." There was a knowing quality to the sheriff's question that made Lillian suspect Mary wasn't the only one who had noticed the changing nature of her relationship with Xavier. "Very well," Xavier answered, with a glance at Lillian that sent warmth flooding through her. "Don't know how I managed without her, truth be told," the sheriff chuckled. "Thought as much. Well, enjoy the evening, you two." As the night progressed, Lillian found herself relaxing, enjoying the simple pleasure of socializing after months of relative isolation at the ranch. She and Xavier moved through the gathering together, stopping to chat with acquaintances, sampling the potluck offerings, listening to the music. When the band struck up a waltz, Xavier turned to her with a questioning look. "Would you care to dance, Lillian?" Her heart quickened at the prospect. "I'd love to, though I must warn you, it's been some time since I've had the opportunity to practice." "Makes two of us," Xavier admitted as he led her to the area cleared for dancing. "Never was much good at it to begin with." Despite their mutual disclaimers, they moved together with surprising grace. Xavier's hand at her waist was warm and steady, guiding her through the steps with more confidence than he'd claimed. Lillian found herself swept up in the music and the moment, acutely conscious of his proximity, of the occasional brush of his chest against hers as they turned. "You dance very well for someone who claims no practice," she teased, looking up to find his eyes already on her face. Good partner makes all the difference, he replied softly. The intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. For a moment, the crowd around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, moving together in the warm spring night. The spell was broken by a sharp voice nearby. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Lillian turned to see Alina standing at the edge of the dancing area, her mouth twisted in a contemptuous smile. Beside her stood a thin, balding man Lillian recognized as Mr. Peterson, a widower known for his wealth and sour disposition. "Alina," Lillian acknowledged coolly, feeling Xavier's hand tighten slightly at her waist. "Living in sin seems to agree with you," Alina continued, loud enough for nearby dancers to hear. "Though I'm surprised you have the nerve to show your face in decent society." Lillian felt as though she'd been slapped. Before she could respond, Xavier stepped slightly forward, his expression hardening. "Madam, I suggest you reconsider your words very carefully. Miss Andrews is here as my guest and under my protection." Alina sniffed, unimpressed. "Protection? Is that what they're calling it these days?" By now, several people had stopped dancing to watch the confrontation. Lillian felt humiliation burning through her, despite having done nothing wrong. Alina had achieved exactly what she wanted: public embarrassment. "If you'll excuse us," Xavier said stiffly, beginning to guide Lillian away. But Alina wasn't finished. "I always knew you were no better than you should be, Lillian. Just like your mother, putting on airs with her books and education, but willing to throw herself at any man who'd have her." The attack on her mother was more than Lillian could bear. She turned back, anger replacing embarrassment. "You will not speak of my mother that way. Unlike you, she was a woman of genuine kindness and integrity who never needed to tear others down to feel important." Alina's face flushed with anger. "How dare you speak to me like that, you ungrateful?" "That's quite enough, Alina." Sheriff Miller's authoritative voice cut through the tension as he stepped between the women. "This is a community celebration, not a place for personal vendettas." Alina glared at him. "Are you going to let these two flaunt their immoral arrangement in front of the whole town? What kind of example does that set?" The sheriff's bushy eyebrows drew together. "Only immoral arrangement I see is throwing your stepdaughter out to freeze to death in a blizzard. Now, unless you want me to remind everyone present about that particular Christian act of yours, I suggest you move along and enjoy the music." Alina's mouth opened and closed several times, but finding no effective retort, she finally turned on her heel and stalked away, a confused-looking Mr. Peterson trailing behind her. "Thank you, Sheriff," Lillian said quietly, mortification still burning in her cheeks. Sheriff Miller's stern expression softened. "Pay her no mind, Miss Andrews. Most folks here know your character and Mr. Morgan's too well to give any credence to such talk." As the sheriff moved away, Xavier turned to Lillian, concern evident in his features. "I'm sorry about that. Perhaps coming tonight wasn't the best idea." "No," Lillian said firmly, despite her lingering embarrassment. "I won't let Alina drive me away from a community gathering. That would only give her more power." Xavier's expression warmed with admiration. "You're right, of course. Shall we continue our dance?" But the mood had been broken, the easy joy of the evening tarnished by Alina's venom. Though they rejoined the dancers, Lillian found herself acutely conscious of the glances and whispers directed their way. Not all were hostile. Mary gave her an encouraging smile from across the square, and several other acquaintances nodded respectfully, but the weight of public scrutiny was uncomfortable nonetheless. After another hour, during which they made polite conversation with various townspeople but avoided further dancing, Lillian touched Xavier's arm. "Would you mind terribly if we left a bit early?" Understanding immediately, Xavier nodded. "I'll get the wagon." The ride home began in silence. both lost in their own thoughts as the town lights receded behind them. The night was clear and cool, countless stars spread across the vast prairie sky. Despite the unpleasantness with Alina, Lillian found her spirits lifting as they drew closer to the ranch to home, as she had come to think of it. "I'm sorry about what happened," Xavier said finally, breaking the silence. "Alina had no right to speak to you that way." "It's not your fault," Lillian assured him. "Alina has always resented me, and by extension, my mother. I should have expected something like this." Xavier's hands tightened on the reins. "What she said about us, about our arrangement." Lillian tensed, uncertain where he was heading with this line of conversation. "People will always talk, Xavier. It doesn't matter." "Doesn't it?" He glanced at her, his expression difficult to read in the starlight. "Because it matters to me, Lillian. What people think about you matters to me." A cold weight settled in Lillian's stomach. Was he regretting their arrangement? Had Alina's public accusations made him reconsider the propriety of having an unmarried woman living on his property? "I understand," she said carefully, trying to keep the hurt from her voice. "If you feel our current situation is becoming problematic, I could look for a position in town. Perhaps Mrs. Johnson at the hotel might need help, or—" "What?" Xavier interrupted, sounding genuinely shocked. "No, Lillian, that's not what I meant at all." He pulled the wagon to a halt in the middle of the road, turning to face her fully. "I don't want you to leave. The exact opposite, in fact." Confused, Lillian searched his face in the dim light. "I don't understand." Xavier took a deep breath. "I've been trying to find the right moment, the right words. I'm not good at this sort of thing." He ran a hand through his hair in that now familiar gesture of nervousness. "What I'm trying to say badly is that I care for you, Lillian, more than as an employee or even a friend. I think I have since that first day, when you opened your eyes in my cabin and immediately tried to sit up despite being half frozen." Lillian's heart began to race as the meaning of his words sank in. "Xavier, please, let me finish before I lose my nerve," he said quickly. "I know our beginning was unusual. I know there's been talk, but none of that matters to me. What matters is that these past months with you have been the happiest of my life. The ranch has become a home because you're in it. And I find myself hoping, perhaps foolishly, that you might feel something similar." Emotion swelled in Lillian's chest, too big to contain. "It's not foolish," she whispered. "I do feel the same." The confession hung in the air between them, momentous and fragile. Xavier reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and touched her cheek with gentle fingers. "Then perhaps," he said softly, "we should give the town something real to talk about." He leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tentative at first, then growing in confidence as Lillian responded, her hands coming up to rest on his shoulders. When they finally drew apart, both a little breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Lillian Andrews. I think I have almost from the moment I found you in the snow. And if you'll have me, I'd like to court you properly, with an eye toward making our arrangement permanent in a way even Alina couldn't criticize." Joy bubbled up inside Lillian, bright and effervescent. "Are you proposing, Xavier Morgan?" He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she'd come to adore. "Not quite yet. I want to do that right with a ring on one knee, the whole business. This is more. Asking permission to ask, I suppose." Lillian laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Permission granted, Mr. Morgan, though I should warn you my answer is likely to be yes." His smile broadened into a grin. "I'll keep that in mind." He kissed her once more, briefly but with a promise of more to come, then picked up the reins again. "We should get home before the horses fall asleep in the road." Home. The word had never sounded sweeter to Lillian's ears. The courtship of Xavier Morgan and Lillian Andrews became the talk of Bismarck over the following months, though this time the gossip was largely good-natured. Their story how he had rescued her during the blizzard, their unusual beginning, and their gradual journey from employer and employee to equals in love caught the romantic imagination of the community. Even Aliner's attempts to continue spreading malicious rumors fell flat as people witnessed the obvious devotion between the couple. When Xavier formally proposed in July, presenting Lillian with his mother's ring during a picnic by the creek that ran through his property, there were few who didn't wish them well. The wedding took place in late September, when the harvest was in and the prairie wore its autumn colors. They chose to hold the ceremony at the ranch rather than in town, with Pastor Williams officiating beneath an arch of golden cottonwood branches Xavier had constructed for the occasion. Mary served as Lillian's maid of honor, while Sheriff Miller, who had become something of a father figure to the couple, gave the bride away. The entire community turned out for the celebration, bringing food, music, and good wishes. Lillian wore a simple gown of ivory silk that Mary had helped her make, with lace from her mother's wedding dress incorporated into the bodice. Her hair was adorned with wildflowers, and around her neck hung her mother's locket, a tangible connection to the family she had lost. When Xavier saw her walking toward him across the yard where they had worked side by side for months, his expression of wonder and love was all the validation Lillian needed that she had made the right choice. "You are the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," he whispered as she reached him, his green eyes shining with emotion. "Even more than a new calf taking its first steps." She teased gently, remembering his earlier words. His laugh was warm and full of joy. "Even more than that, though it's a close contest." Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promises to love, honor, and cherish, to stand together through the hardships and joys that prairie life would inevitably bring. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, and Xavier kissed her before their assembled friends and neighbors, Lillian felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. The celebration continued well into the evening, with dancing and feasting under lantern light as the prairie stars emerged overhead. Even Aliner made a brief, stiff appearance, offering wooden congratulations before departing early, a gesture that, while far from warm, at least acknowledged the legitimacy of the union. Later, after the guests had departed and they were alone in the cabin that was now officially their shared home, Xavier took Lillian's hands in his. "Happy, Mrs. Morgan?" he asked, the new name making her smile. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she admitted, leaning into his embrace. "Though I'm still getting used to the idea that this is real, that you're my husband, that we'll build a life together here." Xavier's arms tightened around her. "Very real, though sometimes I still think I might wake up and find it was all a dream, that I never found you that night in the snow." Lillian shuddered at the thought. "Thank God you did." "Providence," Xavier agreed solemnly, "or fate, or just plain good luck. Whatever it was, I'm grateful for it every day." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. "I love you, Lillian Morgan." The new name sent a thrill through her. "And I love you, Xavier Morgan, more than I have words to express." As it turned out, words weren't necessary to express the depth of their feelings that night, or in the days and weeks that followed as they settled into married life. Their partnership, already strong from months of working side by side, deepened into something even more meaningful as they shared their dreams, fears, and hopes for the future. The ranch prospered under their joint care. Xavier's cattle operation expanded, while Lillian added a thriving vegetable garden and began experimenting with hardy fruit trees that might survive the Dakota climate. They worked hard but together, making decisions as equals, their different perspectives and skills complementing each other perfectly. Winter came again, but this time Lillian faced it without fear, secure in the warmth of her home and her husband's love. On the anniversary of the blizzard that had nearly taken her life, and instead had led her to Xavier, they sat before the fire in their cabin, drinking hot cider and reflecting on the remarkable year that had passed. If someone had told me then, as I was stumbling through the snow, that in a year's time I'd be happily married to the man who found me, I'd have thought them mad, Lillian mused, leaning against Xavier's shoulder. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Life has a way of surprising us. Speaking of which, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. I have something for you, an anniversary gift of sorts. Curious, Lillian unwrapped the package to find a small leather-bound book. Opening it, she discovered it was a journal. The page is blank except for an inscription on the first leaf, written in Xavier's careful hand, for Lillian Morgan, so that our story may be remembered in years to come. With all my love, Xavier. Tears sprang to Lillian's eyes as she traced the words with her finger. It's perfect, she whispered. Thank you. Xavier's arm tightened around her shoulders. I thought you might record our life here for ourselves, and perhaps someday for our children. The mention of children sent a flutter through Lillian's stomach, a flutter that, in recent weeks, she had begun to suspect might be more than just emotion. About that, she said slowly, setting the journal aside and taking Xavier's hand. I've been waiting for the right moment to tell you. I think we may need to prepare the nursery sooner rather than later. For a moment, Xavier looked confused, then understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by an expression of such joy and wonder that Lillian felt tears threatening again. You're sure? He asked, his voice hushed. Lillian nodded, smiling through her own emotion. Dr. Richards confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. We're going to have a baby, likely in early summer. Xavier gathered her into his arms with a whoop of delight that made her laugh. A baby, our baby. He placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach, his expression softening into awe. Hello, little one. I'm your papa and I can't wait to meet you. The simple gesture, so full of love and anticipation, made Lillian's heart swell. This was what she had found in the Dakota Territory, not just survival or independence, but a true home, a partnership based on mutual respect and deep affection. And now, the promise of a family of their own. As snow fell softly outside, reminiscent of the storm that had brought them together, Lillian and Xavier remained by the fire, talking of the future, planning for the child who would join them, dreaming together as only those who have found their perfect match can do. Their beginning had been unusual, a desperate young woman thrown out in winter, a compassionate cowboy who found her frozen and brought her inside. But from that dramatic start had grown something beautiful and enduring, a love strong enough to weather any storm the frontier might bring. And as Lillian drifted to sleep that night in her husband's arms, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, home at last, in the heart of the wild Dakota prairie, and in the heart of the man who had saved her in more ways than one. The following summer, under a sky as vast and blue as possibility itself, Lillian gave birth to a healthy baby boy they named James, after Xavier's father. As she watched her husband cradle their son, his strong hands impossibly gentle with the tiny bundle, Lillian felt a completeness she had never imagined possible when a leaner had thrust her out into the winter cold 18 months earlier. He has your eyes, Xavier whispered, awestruck as the infant gazed up at him with solemn curiosity. Same beautiful shape, but your coloring, Lillian pointed out, touching the downy dark hair on their son's head. He'll be breaking hearts before we know it. Life on the Morgan Ranch continued to flourish as their family grew. 2 years after James came a daughter, Catherine, with her mother's auburn hair and her father's determined chin. The children thrived in the freedom of prairie life, learning early the value of hard work, the importance of family, and the beauty of the wild land that was their heritage. Through all the seasons that followed the harsh winters, the bountiful summers, the endless cycle of ranch life, Xavier and Lillian remained devoted to each other, partners in all things. Their love story, begun in the depths of a Dakota blizzard, became a cornerstone of local legend, a reminder that even in the harshest circumstances, warmth and love could be found. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the prairie wind sang around their sturdy home, Xavier would take Lillian's hand and whisper, "Thank God for that storm," and she would smile, knowing exactly what he meant. For without that terrible night, without Alina's cruelty, without the bitter cold that had nearly claimed her life, she might never have found the man who had warmed not just her freezing body, but her heart and soul as well. In the end, that was the truth they carried with them through all their years together on the wild Dakota frontier. Sometimes the coldest nights can lead to the warmest beginnings, and sometimes being lost is the only way to truly be found.